Borodar, and welcome to our next session. For me, this is one of the most important sessions that we're having during this annual conference. Challenging racism and inequality in the housing sector and wider society. The COVID-19 pandemic and its disproportionate impact on Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities has been profound. The reasons for this have been linked to long-standing inequalities related to socioeconomic disadvantage, structural racism, and lack of Black, Asian, minority ethnic influence in strategic matters. The simultaneous rise of the Black Lives Matter movement following the death of George Floyd has also highlighted the systemic inequalities faced by communities of colour in the UK. In this session, we'll hear from people who work in the housing and support sector about their perspectives on this issue and what they want to see change in our sector and society. Despite the focus in this area, race is still a difficult conversation for many, and there'll be inevitably a bit of discomfort in the room. We want this to be a challenge to the audience. We've asked the panel to be honest and open about their experiences and about challenging others. We want you to remember that this session is a safe space. We want people in the audience to be mindful of what they say. Please do use the Q&A. Please do ask questions and offer your reflections. It's really important that we have that interaction. But please be mindful of what you say. We know that conversations around privilege and racism can make people defensive, but we hope people have attended this session open to that challenge, open to learning, and open to the conversation that we're about to have. I'm really delighted to introduce our chair for this session. Nazia Azad-Warren has been a colleague of mine at Cymorth. She led the Homelessness World Cup Legacy project for us and has since gone on to work at Cadwyn Housing Association. For those who follow her on Twitter, you'll know that she's an outspoken fighter for social justice, and we're absolutely delighted that she's agreed to chair this really important session today. So without much ado, I'll hand over to Nazia. Thank you, Nazia.
Hello, everyone, and Katie, thank you so much for your kind words. I want to firstly start this session by saying thank you to Cymorth for inviting me to speak and chair this panel today. The fact that this is happening at a Cymorth conference and this conversation is happening is exactly where we need to be. Secondly, I'd like to say thank you to my fellow panelists who have agreed to speak. So I'd like to, in due course, introduce Abdi Segulle, Project Manager at Taff Housing Association, and Amal Beyrouty, Project Manager and Senior Advice and Advocacy Officer at Women Connect First. Thank you so much for joining me and being willing to share your own reflections with me and the audience that join us today. I appreciate that a lot of those reflections come from both your personal and professional life, and I really hope that our audience get a lot from it. And thirdly, thank you to everyone who's joined us today for this particular discussion. I know it's not easy for people to talk about race and inequality from a race perspective. It's even more difficult to contemplate and really reflect on things like privilege, particularly white privilege, and the sort of reflecting on where at times we have been complicit and nowhere near as progressive as we need to be. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Nazia Azad-Warren, and I've been working in and around the housing sector since 2015. As Katie mentioned, my current role is with Cadwyn Housing Association, and as their tenant engagement lead, I'm really looking at how we can truly capture the voices of our tenants to ensure that they are shaping every part of our business, and ensuring the voices of people who have traditionally been overlooked is really important to me. Before I begin on my reflections, I thought it was really important to give you all a little bit of background on who I am, or parts of me, and what parts of my journey has been like. I come from a very traditional working class Bangladeshi household, born and raised in Cardiff, the oldest of three. I spent my childhood doing things like, you know, very stereotypical child of migrants type of thing, you know, translating letters from the council, filling out housing benefit forms for my parents, translating for my mum during appointments, and still doing a lot of that, really. And we also as a family lived through losing our home and sofa surfing at quite a young age. So those are some of my experiences and some of the things that have shaped me as a person. And for me, it's important that you know that I am here today talking about my personal insights through my lived experiences, and I can only truly represent myself. I am not a voice for the Bangladeshi community in Cardiff. I'm not a voice for anyone else. And I think that's a crucial part of the conversation when we're talking about BAME representation. I think a handful of minority ethnic people cannot ever represent communities of colour in isolation. So this is the conversations that we need to have around facilitating, creating platforms so voices are raised and can be heard and listened to. I think, you know, it's really important to recognise that people from minority communities, we're not a monolith, and we have different experiences, we have different struggles, and within that we also have varying degrees of privilege that we'd also need to talk about within our own communities. So within diverse groups, there is still a wide range of difference, and I appreciate that a lot of people already know this, but I don't necessarily feel that it is understood as well as it can be. Racism is a very complex, multi-layered and insidious construct, and the conversation around tackling it in you know, within a housing and support context, and indeed in wider society, that sort of conversation and that action will take years and years and years. We're talking about dismantling systems, and as such, we're not going to cover an iota of what needs to be covered in this session alone. However, I'm firmly of the belief that all our audience members know this, and my hope is that this is part of / one of the many conversations and discussions that you're having within your own organisations and within your own personal lives as part of your own personal journeys as well. So moving forward as a panel, we've been asked to provide our own reflections on how, as a housing sector, we can challenge racism and inequality. And, you know, I know Katie's given a little bit of context, but I just wanted to revisit what has been said, because I feel it's pertinent to the conversation. The pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on Black, Asian and minority ethnic people. And I completely appreciate that there has likely not been any community that hasn't been impacted adversely. However, BAME communities have been hit disproportionately hard. And as Katie was saying, the reasons for this are linked to long-standing inequalities related to socioeconomic disadvantage, structural racism, and lack of influence in very important strategic decision matters. And then simultaneously, in that same timeline, we have had a rise in the Black Lives Matter movement following the death of George Floyd, which has really shone a light on wider structural and deeply embedded institutional racism that, I have to add, is not simply observed in the States. It's not just an American issue, but it's very prevalent in the UK and indeed in Wales. So with this context in mind, I'd like to start my reflections on some of the reasons as to why I think we as a sector haven't made as much progress as we could / should have, and how we can improve moving forward. Firstly, I think that it's important to recognise the role that our reasons for existing as a sector can and has played in inhibiting progress towards a more equitable society for minority ethnic communities, indeed the ones that we serve. So, you know, and that can be quite a difficult concept to overcome. And I think, you know, a lot of it is around sort of what do you mean by that? I think for me, when I reflect on it, I think as a sector, we have an intrinsically good purpose. We provide crucial housing and support to those who need it most. And I truly believe, and whilst I'm not in a position to talk for everyone, there's a lot of passion in our sector, and you know, we have a sector full of people who want to do things to improve the lives of those in vulnerable circumstances, people on low income backgrounds, people experiencing adversity, hardships, and so on. And we do have a sector full of people who want to help and create and sustain thriving communities. So with that being said, and given the context of that's our sort of overall purpose, framework, whatever you want to frame it as, I think any criticism / challenge around inequality and lack of progress made towards the sector can be met with, or has been met with, a lot of defensiveness around the sector's actions or lack thereof. And that's for me where I see progress being hindered, because effectively the sort of, when someone is challenging you around this, and at our core we have a social purpose, the challenge that, you know, we haven't provided culturally appropriate and sensitive service provision for our minority communities, housing that meets the community's needs, raising the voices, giving representation, all of that stuff. When that sort of challenge is made, and we are in a sector full of, you know, wanting to do good, and the purpose of it is to do good, it can feel like somewhat of a personal attack when your intentions are to create long-lasting and sustained positive change for people, and you are being challenged that you haven't done enough. For me, I can very much understand that this is a natural reaction. You know, however, for what it's worth, you know, in my humble opinion, it's an incredibly damaging reaction, because what it does is that it stifles the conversation before it's really had a chance to go anywhere. As a housing sector, we know that we have significant challenges and have not made the progress that we ought to have when it comes to our minority ethnic communities. I've been having many conversations with people of colour, you know, in a professional capacity, but also in my personal life. And you know what the resounding message is that what is being said right now and the conversations being had, it's not groundbreaking, it's not a surprise. These things have been said for a very long time. It's almost recycled. So you know, we've known about this for a very long time, so we need to meet this sort of intention now to overcome this with robust action. In housing, we know that we have significant challenges that we need to overcome, and I'm not going to go into anything in much depth, but you know, we know, for instance, there is a considerable lack of representation across the sector, but particularly in leadership positions, and we need to improve that, and we need to improve that fast. I still think that there is an attitude that it's either people of colour going for the job or people with the skills, and that the bias is those two things are mutually exclusive. And we really need to check ourselves. We really need to do more in recognizing our own bias and challenging ourselves to do better. I feel that despite, you know, things like equality and diversity training being rolled out, and, you know, people really sort of having conversations around this, I think there's still a significant issue around understanding the needs of those from minority backgrounds. And there's a paucity of services that reflects the needs of communities. In Wales, obviously not counting, you know, we're going through a new census period, but I believe the latest stat was 5.9% of people identify as BAME in Wales. And but that distribution of people is very, very uneven. So for example, in Wrexham, we've got just under 2%. In Cardiff, we have almost 20% of people identifying as BAME. And when it comes to lack of service provision, especially in areas where the population rates are so high, I think it's a real shame when there are gaps, and it's quite telling. As housing folk, we know that people from minority ethnic backgrounds are more likely to be living in overcrowded properties, in poorer quality housing, living in deprivation. And there are so many stats and so many headlines that I can give you. And I don't want to use my time up going through things that are easily Googleable. And, you know, I think that's where we need to do the work as well. And I think it's important, but the reason I say that and mention these stats is because I think it's important to remind ourselves of where we are now and how much progress we need to make and the importance of challenge in that. So going back to that sort of challenge and the defensiveness and our social purpose, I understand on a human level that, you know, you've been working really hard to make change happen for people. So when you are being challenged and saying that actually not doing as much for minority ethnic communities, I understand how difficult that may be to digest, but without that challenge, we as a sector and we as people will not progress. So I hope that we can be more accepting of it as we move forward. Having said all of the above, I think there is a lot of work happening right now. I think the fact that we're here talking about this is a reflection of the sector's commitment. And I know we're all, you know, lots of organisations and people in our sector are really reflecting and putting together robust action plans for improving. And I welcome this. I'm here for it. I want it to continue and for us not to become complacent in our journeys towards getting to a more equitable society. And I feel that as a sector, those of us who are doing the work and having a lot of conversations around race, experiences, privilege and disadvantage, discrimination and racism, all of this is essential to our growth as a sector. But I call on organisations to really listen to their BAME staff, but also protect them from a well-being perspective. As someone, as a Bangladeshi woman, I can't speak for anyone else, but I feel that this protest has been exhausting. You're talking about really personal things, you know, experience of microaggressions, experience of direct racism and discrimination. And it's really difficult. It is hard. So, and I think where we are right now is that organisations are wanting to include their BAME staff in these very vital conversations. And because of the sort of hierarchies, a lot of those BAME staff are in more junior positions. So what I would call on for organisations to do is not to exclude people, not to exclude their BAME staff from those conversations, but to be inclusive. However, wrap some support around it, around well-being. My time has just gone off, so I'm going to quickly wrap up. But just going back to that point, I think right now there is a light shining on BAME people in the sector in a way that has never been done before. But without the due respect and the support around well-being, that light that is currently shining is not going to do much to illuminate our voices and experiences for the good of the sector. So there are so many things that I'd like to talk about, raise, but within the confines of time management, I'd like to take the opportunity to say thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Cymorth. Thank you, audience. And I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Abdi Segulle. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Naz. I think that will be a hard act to follow. I think you spoke passionately about some of the issues that I have been reflecting on myself. Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for the invite. And my name is Abdi Segulle, and my position is a project manager, and I work for Taff Housing Association. And on reflecting on the question itself, challenging racism and inequality in the housing sector and in wider society, just talk about a little bit of background about myself. I arrived here in 1990 as a young boy, as a part of a family of 11 children, and my mother, there was 12 of us. We didn't speak a word of English. We landed in Manchester. We were put in a hostel, and that was my first experience of overcrowding, but also it was my first experience of and my introduction to social housing and the principles of the founding principles of social housing, because within weeks we had somebody who from our community, she came to us and she spoke the language, and she looked like one of us and we could relate, and we thought she was just a family member who's been here for many, many years, and she's going to just help us out. And I think a couple of months down the line, I found out that she actually worked for a local housing charity, and she was there to help us. And I thought that's really, really nice. That's something that I like to do. Maybe in the years to come, I would like to help. And that was in 1990, and I grew up and I arrived here in Wales, and I started working in the sector in 2002. I started, but in terms of racism in society, I have experienced in many incidents in terms of going to football matches or playing football in the park, or in my interaction with the police. So experiencing racism has been something that has been part of my journey growing up here in England and in Wales. So there's in that sense there is nothing new. But in terms of the inequalities and racism within the housing sector, I like to rather than talk about my my personal reflection on that, I like to kind of read out some of the reports and research that has been done, and I picked out one particular one, and this was by Dominic Brady in 2020, Inside Housing, and the title was Social Housing Likes to Talk fine words about fighting racism, but does it back that with action? And in the report, it was talking about the BME specialist housing associations in late 80s, just after the London riots. And in that report, there's a chief executive of the Arawak Walton, and Seaman D'Souza, and she's also the chair of the BME National, which represents most of the remaining BME and housing associations, highlights the vacuum that was left behind. And she gone on to say that at times has gone that specialism was dumped down a bit by mainstream organizations. And I think we have lost something in terms of understanding our tenants and who we house. She continued to argue that, and she said, the focus has become more about growth and development of homes rather than serving particular communities. And in that report, it talks about some of the contributing factors of the London riots was that the lack of specialist houses and homes for the BME community, particularly the Black community, and the lack of representation. And she adds that not only have the organizations have lost touch with communities, BME leaders have become less visible in these large organizations. So as they were taken over by big organizations, what was happening was that there has been change also in terms of representation. So these organizations will come in, and the BME chief executive who run those specialist housing associations were taken over, and they have disappeared. And why is this important? She said, we have lost a lot of BME chief executives along the way, where specialist BME organizations have been moved into a group structure. Why is this important? It is important for Black experience in the UK to see symbol of our success. And I link that to my experience, because when I work in the community, and people know that I work for housing associations, and what I want is when I speak to the youth and the youngsters and the ones that we coach in football. I want them to understand that they can actually have a career in housing. And if the elderlies in the community understand that I am either a chief executive or a director of a housing association, they will go back to their kids, and some of them already told me this. They will go back to their kids and they will tell them, there is a career in housing. We would like you, maybe you could consider that rather than an engineer. There's nothing wrong with that, but you're being a doctor, because that's what parents do. I remember some of my uncles saying, so and so has got a son who's a doctor. I'd like you to be a doctor. I want parents to tell their kids, I want you to be a chief executive of our housing associations, because as Nazia said, the founding principles of housing associations was to fight inequality, was to fight injustice within our society, in using housing as a driving mechanism to drive that inequality. And in that report, and Inside Housing 2019 has done a diversity survey, which actually has found that 66% of landlords had no BME representation on their executive team. Just 4.5% of executives of those that chose to complete the survey identified as BME, while BME representation on those organizations' boards stood only 6.7%. And that is in England. If we use that as what is happening here in Wales, I had a chat with a chief executive of a housing association here in Wales, who was very supportive of me trying to get some information. And I found that I think there is about just over between 30 to 35 housing associations here in Wales. And I think there are not only 2 BME chief executives in that. And the 2 housing associations, I think of those 2 executives, I don't think they actually operate within the centrals of Cardiff, within the inner cities. And they got BME chief executives. And I asked my young boy to actually go through it and to see if he can find me the ethnicity of every chief executive of these housing associations. And I just asked him to put W for white and B for black and ethnic minority. And he came back with 2. And he asked me, he said to me, why are you doing that? So I'm going to be doing talk about housing association and housing sector and inequality. He said, well, that's interesting because there are not many in here. I said, yeah, that's the reason why I'm doing this talk. And I particularly asked him that because when I talk about racism within society, I always tell my kids to be aware of some of the things that are happening so they can actually understand how to navigate the difficulties of living in a society where many of us experience inequalities and racism. It says that in that report, it highlights the lack of progress, and a survey in 2000, a survey of BME employment in a non-BME housing association found only 3.7% of senior management posts were filled by BME staff members. And why is that important? Because what I just read it talks about the lack of representation. And I know many of you who have heard me speak in the past, talk about the lack of representations within social housing. And there was a report in the financial report, and a blog from the London and School of Economics highlighted that the BME households were more likely to wait longer for housing offers. Now you see the lack of representation, what it brings is this is the result of the lack of representations within housing association in terms of leadership management. And in this, he said that they're more likely to wait for longer a housing offer. They'll to be offered poor quality homes, flats rather than houses. And additionally, the author claimed that some of the housing officers were seen to be steering BME applicants away from wide neighborhoods based on judgment about social class and as well as racial grounds. It is not a coincidence that when we talk about ethnic and multicultural communities, we talk about Grangetown, we talk about Butetown, we talk about on the fringes of, Riverside, we talk about on the fringes of Roath, going into a little bit into Canton, maybe into Splot. That is not a coincidence. And when we talk about inequalities and when we talk about how some of the issues that is happening in our communities, because the lack of poor housing, because of the overcrowding, this is the result of lack of representation within the housing sector. And a research by Shelter found that between 2012 and 2017, there was 22% increase of statutory homelessness. Among white households, it rose 9%, whereas homelessness among BME households rose 48%. And in the same research, Shelter said that there is no doubt that the racial prejudice within letting market is likely to be a factor. So not only the BME communities are facing inequalities in a multifaceted issues around across the societies, but also they are facing something that is very close to my heart, which is in the housing sector, be it private or be within social housing. And in a journal, Sage Journal, it talks about there was a report, and the report that talks about ethnic inequalities in housing have been related to historical place-based discrimination and hostility towards ethnic minority groups, which force Black and Asian migrants into a poor private rented accommodations and the worst of own occupied housing in the declining inner cities. This kind of talks about some of the issues that we're facing today within our communities in the overcrowding. You got multi-generations living in one household. You got the grandfather, you got the mother, you got maybe the daughter who's married, you got the children. So you got 3 or 4 different generations living in one house, maybe 2 or 3 bedroom. I have experienced that in 1990. And that is how many years ago? Over 3 decades. And that is happening today. When I speak to people in the community, I've experienced exactly what I have experienced back in 1990. And that is still happening. What does that tell you? It tells you that it's still inequalities, it's still prejudice is existing within our sector. And that needs to be fixed as quickly as possible. And the responsibility on that falls on those who are leading our sector. And the report also talks about housing disadvantages is measured by overcrowding, which indicates whether the household has an adequate space to live in. Housing characterized by poor living conditions can create stress in the home and create negative consequences for well-being, particularly for children. So there is a link between overcrowding and young Black boys experiencing lot of inequality, a lot of bad experiences in society. We see it in the news, how they have been projected, and you know, they're gangsters, they're doing this, they're doing that. All of these things is housing has contributed to that, because when you got a house full of 10 people living in one house with 2 or 3 bedroom, it's going to drive those youngsters to look for alternatives, and usually that alternatives is falling with the wrong crowd, where they will be offered a place to stay, but with that they'll be offered other things that are illegal, and they will fall into trouble, and then they'll be experiencing their contact with the police, and then what happens after that is just a downfall. So I think overcrowding is also another issue faced by the BME community. But here in Wales, as I talked about, the lack of representation in leadership management is an issue, because if BME talent don't progress within organizations and they don't actually have a seat at the table, they cannot influence. And I'll say they cannot influence because in 2002, the Welsh government has produced the BME Housing Action Plan for Wales. And in that, it said the number 1 was in the aims and objectives. It said social landlords to understand, articulate local BME housing requirements. I mean, understand and articulate. If you can't understand the language, if you don't look like them, if you don't talk like them, then how are you going to articulate what their needs are? So if there is a lack of representation with your organization, then you're not going to be serving that community the way they should be served. Although nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to discriminate against ethnic minorities, by not doing the right thing, you are doing exactly just that. But also in the report, we talked about COVID-19, which is actually what is happening right now, and then going into what's happening in America and the killing of the innocent man. But COVID-19, we all understand that. The reason why it is impacting more likely on the BME community is because we work on the front line. Is because we live in an overcrowded housing. Some people don't have the luxury of going, staying a family member because they've got a spare room. None of that majority of the BME communities don't actually have that luxury. And also because they're working in the front line. And what is happening is that they're the people who are going to be serving the community, so they'll be exposed more to COVID-19. And in the Royal College of Physicians, the Vice President for Wales, Dr. Alwyn Williams, said, they welcome the report and the findings. It is important that we understand the key findings from the report, that long-standing disadvantages and the lack of BME representation in decision-making processes contributed in some part of the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on people from the BME background. And that tells you, okay, if you're living in overcrowding, some of the youth in that house may be looking for an alternative, and alternative comes with consequences. They're not going to be shielding in a room because they have to share with their brother or sister or their cousin. They cannot afford not go to work because they are working in ad hoc jobs, or they're working in jobs where there's 0-hour contracts, or they're working with jobs on the front line where there's a lot of pressure coming from their management. So a lot of these issues are some of the issues that are faced by the BME communities. But there are positives, and I would welcome the type out deeds but not words pledges. And also there are amazing housing associations in Cardiff that are making great progress in terms of representation. And my recommendation, to end with this, with my reflection, is that the recommendation is that representation is important, opportunity is important, creating space for BME talent within your organization is important, challenging racism is quite important. Don't hold back, reflect and create a legacy, because no one will remember how big your wage package is and how big your house is and nice car you drive. People will always remember the changes that you have made in their lives. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Abdi. Really powerful and just really relevant information. Thank you so much. I'd like to introduce our third and final speaker for today's session, Amal. Amal, who joins us from Women Connect First. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazia. Thank you, Cymorth, for inviting me to represent Women Connect First and share the reflections of our experience and in providing what we experience with the different communities of color. First, I'd like to introduce my organization. We are a charity established in 2001 to maximize the participation and integration of vulnerable BME families and from the diverse communities. We provide services which are culturally appropriate and opportunities to meet, learn, and develop together. Our mission is to offer holistic and safe space for the BME women in Cardiff and enhance their life, ensure their voices are heard at all levels. We cater for all women and their families. And we have around 28 different ethnicities. So there is a lot of BME with us. And since the lockdown, we started discovering new ways of living with the lockdown and this rapidly growing digital world. So all our activities became remote. and our advice service has become remote, either virtual or over the phone. This service has been increased and due to the COVID-19, and the number of our participants and clients have doubled. Our advice service is small. We are limited to 2 members of staff, but we have really dealt with, over this last year, with 220 different cases. 33% of these are housing problems. Well, our homes have never been more central to our lives than during this past year. As we live in the lockdown and the added chaos of the pandemic, we're spending much more time at home than usual. Yes, working from home is putting a lot of pressure on us as staff, not only at Women Connect, but in different other organizations and workplaces. But this does not compare with the experience of people who live in unfit housing conditions, which made the experience of living at home worse due to the significant housing problems. People are living in homes that are too damp, too cold, too small, unhealthy conditions, pests, disrepair, crowding, noise, dispute with neighbors. If we look at the wider implications that these problems, the negative impact on the physical and mental health of the people resulted in family problems, domestic violence, increased drug misuse among the youth, divorce, leaving people trapped in unfit homes and powerless to do anything about it. I quote some of the women who say, we've been in lockdown, but we are in lockdown inside our homes because of the damp, the mold, and no one cares. Actually, the main challenges that I find in the housing sector, and which has really increased racism, is in the social housing and with DSS landlords. The social housing, there is inequality and lack of consideration of housing conditions and requirements of the tenants. There is unfair housing offers and allocations, housing opportunities to BME families. There is no fair policies and ethnic monitoring, localized needs assessment of delivery. I think the staff require more training and understanding of the diverse cultures, and they need to take more positive actions in allocating offers to the tenants. The tenant is offered 2 options, and if they refuse it, they lose and they are out of the list. But these offers that they get, they don't match neither the health or the ability of the client. There are no checks, no hazard and safety check or environmental checks on the property. So if they are going to take a property which has no ventilation, full of damp, it is mold, there is a risk for elderly people who haven't been assessed. They are sent to places where they have to take stairs or go for longer walks. This is putting a lot of pressure on the tenants. And I think there is also lack of understanding or caring for the tenants. I will just use the experience that of our clients. A client who has been offered a house, and after they said, yes, it is okay for you, go, we are signing papers, then it's he lost the offer because the landlord changed his mind and the offer was given to a white person. And I think this is putting a lot of pressure on people. They have young children, sick children, sick people at home, and the offers are not really equal or given equally to the different applicants. There is a lot of disrepair also. Due to COVID, this has been a slow process. And when a tenant is given an appointment, at most times it is cancelled or the work is postponed. Or when the work is done, it is done as patchwork. And if you look inside the houses, it is just patched. And really, if you don't have a home, you won't feel at ease, especially with these difficult days. The other problem are the DSS landlords. They are left unsupervised. There is no protection for the tenant from the financial abuse. Tenants cannot, most of the BME people, they are not able to find, to rent houses. And they lack the language, they lack the knowledge of their rights, and they struggle to secure a house. So they accept whatever is given to them with all the bad housing conditions, just to keep a roof for their family. The contracts they sign is just a piece of paper, and it doesn't give them their rights. The deposits usually is just written there. It is not secure. And the living condition of the houses that they are offered are really very bad. When they complain or they ask for repairs, the landlord says, or the agencies, mainly the agencies, they say, take it or leave it. Because they know if they don't accept it, they're going to be homeless. And if they are homeless and they go to the housing options to claim homelessness, they are also offered houses that are with disrepair. So there is a lot of chaos that is caused among the Black and ethnic minority families in housing. And if there isn't a house where people can live at ease and feel that this is a home, I think a lot of problems will come up within the family. And this is what we have seen, really, a lot of domestic violence. Their children are starting to become violent, use drugs, and we've dealt with a lot of divorce due to this lockdown and the bad housing conditions. Many times we are told that people are choosing areas where they cannot find houses. It's true. It's because of the language barriers. So most of the BME communities, they like to stay within their own communities because they fear of being alone. They lack the knowledge of what to do, so they try to stay within their community, which is safer for them. And they fear if they go in a bit further or in areas where they don't have any friends, they are afraid of any discrimination, which in many times it has happened, and people are left at home. They are scared to leave their houses. There is no security. Asylum seekers, when they are granted leave to remain, usually they don't get a lot of help or they don't know where to go. So most of them, most of the cases that we are dealing with, I'm not saying most of them, the cases that we deal with, they don't know what to do and they become homeless, and it's really very difficult to find spaces for them. We find that most of the Black and ethnic minorities, due to their, they live in poverty because they can't cope with their bills. Some of them have physical and mental health problems, and they are not really looked into. most of the older people or older women that we deal with who have mental health problems, they are not referred to doctors or the mental health service, just given antidepressants and sleeping tablets. And this really is causing a lot of mental health issues, anxiety, and depression among the communities. What I suggest is, and that is my own suggestions from my own experience working with the Black and ethnic minorities for over 13 years, there should be more understanding within these services, the housing services, of the cultures of the ethnic minorities. Sometimes they are not provided with interpreters, or they are provided with telephone interpreting, and most of the people, they can't cope with telephone interpreting, and this is the language barrier has caused a lot of social exclusion among the ethnic minority people, and their fear of being on their own, so they stick to their own communities. Thank you very much. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amal. Thank you. And I'd just like to, I'd like to draw attention to the fact that as someone who works in a third sector organisation for specifically for women and also their families and their other members of their household who are going through this the day-to-day, I think it's really important that we have that connection with you, that you can hold us to account as a housing sector and a support sector, because you're seeing what is happening on the day-to-day, and we may think that we're doing a very good job, but the reality of it may be very different. So I've been trying to answer some of the questions that have been on the Q&A, but I'm very conscious that I am the only person that has been sort of answering on behalf of the speakers. So I'd like to just bring in Abdi for a few minutes, just so that we can sort of, I was wanting to ask, if I ask one question to each, and Amal, if you can stay on, that would be great. That would be great. Can I ask you, Abdi, sort of the audience have asked, what would you like to see the next Welsh Government do to take meaningful action in racism in Wales? And if sorry to do this, but if I give you a minute just to write what you say, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think what can the government do, Welsh Government do? I think that the legislations are not watertight. I think organisations easily can actually work around legislations and just do the bare minimum. What I would like to see is the regulators do more. And I think highlighting the lack of representation and the lack of ethnic minorities within organisations, if that can be reported and published every single year, and we can do a table, name and shame, I think it will be a great. I would like to see that, because I don't think there is not enough organizations within Wales that can hold the associations to account. And I would like to see that. And I have joined a board member of an organization that represents the housing associations. And I think they welcome some of my views on holding our members to account. And I think in the last 12 months that leaders have been reflecting on this issue, but I would like to see the Welsh Government drive through legislations that they can no longer get away with it and be part of the regulators. When they do their regulating reports to our housing associations, they must give them tasks to meet in terms of representation within their organizations and nitty-gritty. What are they doing about it? How many do they have? How many are managers? How many chief executives do we have? Just like we do with gender inequality, we need to do the ethnicity inequality and representation as well. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Abdi. Very succinctly put. Amal, I wanted to ask you this question that's come from our audience, because as a provider of services to diverse communities, a lot of the time, I'm assuming, and people and other organizations are coming to you to do, I don't know, consultation and, learning about sort of experiences of discrimination, disadvantage from the people that you serve. So one of the questions is, a lot of sort of how society in the sector often places the burden of learning about systemic racial inequality on those who have already been sort of being disadvantaged by it. So should there be a duty on organizational leaders to meaningfully engage in this work to improve social justice and outcomes for everyone? To educate themselves and their teams in racial discrimination and equality, and put together actions for them to fix it. What do you think around that? And again, just a couple of minutes, if that's okay.
Well, yes, I think organizations should do training for their staff, regular training on the different and the diverse cultures and their requirements. When we say the BAME people or communities, we are talking about it's a wide range of communities and cultures that differ from one place to the other. So we cannot just generalize that Black and ethnic minorities culture is that, because this is really so many countries and cultures. I could say over 50 different cultures, and it could be more. So there should be always training and understanding. They should be communicating with organizations who deal with the ethnic minorities and consult with them on the different services that they provide. And I think to have the equality in the service, they should understand the nature of the need for the people they are serving. I would also like to add one thing, if I have time. It's really, I would expect to have more regulating and supervision on the services or on the provision of the houses. The DSS houses are in a very bad shape. They are taking advantage of people in the rent, in the repair. Take it or leave it. The house inside the house is really you cannot live in it. I've seen photos of different houses, but there is no control. No one checks. And the houses offered by the social landlords, housing options, they just send people, they give them 2 offers, take it or leave it, and then they are off the list, but the houses are really filled with damp. And if they're going to leave from one house that is damp to another house that is damp, what have they done? So this really, I think there is no respect. They are not respecting the needs of the people they are serving.
Yeah, thank you for that, Amal. And I'd just like to I'm conscious of the time. I know it's lunchtime, so we'll be wrapping up very quickly. However, yes, I think that, obviously...
Sorry, Naz, can I just add something before you come in? Sorry,
yeah.
I apologize. Amal talks about training, and yes, that is great. But I think the best way to overcome training your staff is just to employ people who understand that community. That is the best way of doing it. It's fantastic training. You can train people over different cultures, and you can different backgrounds and religions and all of these things, and conscious bias, all of these things. You can do all of that. But the best way to overcome that is just to increase the representation of BME communities. Make social housing attractive to young BME talent. That is the best way of moving it, because I would like to, if there's chief executives in this conference listening, I think it will be great, that they can actually offer a young BME a week in their organization, or maybe a day to be a chief executive, and then they can see, and then ask them what they think of their experience. And I would bet on my life on it that they would actually say, I don't really see a lot of people who actually look like me, and it would be great. And they'll go back and tell their friends. So I think to come over training, representation matters. And once you represent people within your organization, you'll see change, you'll see growth, you'll see harmony. And what you're going to be doing is that you will be achieving the objective of the founding principles of social housing, which is to fight inequality. Don't let inequality fester within housing associations. Thank you.
I agree with you. I agree with you 100%.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. And yes, I'm fully of that sort of viewpoint as well. What I would like to say is, going back to Amal's discussion, first and foremost around the sort of different tenures and, private rented sector, and we need more regulation around that. But they're also like, we are not sort of, we are not free from that sort of, how do I say, we aren't 100% sort of innocent as well as a social housing sector. And I feel that there is a massive power imbalance. If you understand a power imbalance between tenants in general, then you sort of, that is almost like quantified even more, because you have sort of such deep experiences that are based around race in the UK, and inequality amongst that, poverty, deprivation, language barriers, the sort of the issues around allowing people to have a voice and being able to challenge. It really does go back down there. So there are so many things that we could always talk about, but I'm conscious of time. I'd like to say thank you. I'd like to put a call out as well. If there are other members in the sector that would like to come together to get a mutual support network, share good practice, support one another through our journeys within our organisations, let's do that. Please get in touch with me. And thank you, Cymorth, for having us. And I hope what we have said hits home.
Thank you so much, Diolch yn fawr iawn to all of you. That was a really important discussion to have, and I'm really grateful for your openness, for your challenge, for sharing your experiences, because I think we all have to do more to increase our knowledge and understanding, and we can't only rely on hearing the voices of people from that community to share your experiences. I'm aware that that can bring trauma with it, so I am incredibly grateful for your time and for sharing so openly your experiences and viewpoints today. I hope that has given a lot of food for thought for our audience. I hope there's some things that you can take back to your organisations, that you can do as an individual within society, as well as to challenge things within your workplace. And of course, with the Senedd elections coming up, there's a huge opportunity to make a statement, to challenge candidates and encourage them to put race at the top of their agenda. We're going to take a short break now, but after the break, we have a really important session at 12:15, and that's about hearing from experts by experience. So we'll be hearing from people who've used homelessness, housing and support services in Wales. We'll be hearing their reflections on what can be done differently, what can be done to end homelessness in Wales, and their calls on candidates in the Senedd elections. So please do join us. It's really important that we hear those voices of lived experience, and then we'll be launching our manifesto for the Senedd elections. Look forward to seeing you all at 12:15, and thank you so much again to our fantastic panel. Really appreciate your time, your expertise, your experience. You were fantastic. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much all.